Those moments returned one after another. At first they seemed reassuring. Then a different question emerged. How many times had she been right? More importantly, how many times had she simply been believed? The thought unsettled her. Jessica looked across the terminal toward Marcus. He was speaking quietly with employees. Comfortable, respected, entirely at ease. Nothing about him matched the conclusion she had reached within seconds of seeing him. Yet she had trusted that conclusion completely. The realization created a knot in her stomach. For years, confidence and experience had felt inseparable. Now she wondered whether something else had attached itself to them, something she had never examined, something hidden, beneath routine, beneath praise, beneath certainty. The possibility frightened her. Not because someone else had suggested it, because she had arrived at it herself. Jessica lowered her eyes. The terminal suddenly felt unfamiliar. As if she were seeing it from a different angle. For the first time in a very long while, she doubted her own judgment. And that quiet doubt followed her more closely than any whisper ever could. Jessica expected the situation to become worse. She expected anger, a public complaint, a sharp confrontation that would force everyone to choose sides. Instead, none of it happened. Marcus continued speaking with employees as though the morning had not revolved around him. He answered questions, shook hands, listened when people spoke. Nothing in his behavior suggested a desire for revenge. That was what unsettled Jessica most. A younger pilot approached him near the gate. "Captain Brooks, are you still mentoring the new international crews?" Marcus smiled lightly. "When my schedule allows it." The young man laughed. "They keep hoping you'll be assigned to training." Marcus shrugged. "I'm not sure they're that lucky." Several people smiled. The conversation remained easy and genuine. Jessica watched from a distance. Part of her expected Marcus to mention what had happened. To tell the story. To expose her. He never did. Not once. The encounter seemed available to him if he wanted it. Yet he left it untouched. The station manager stood beside him. Even he avoided discussing the incident publicly. The restraint created its own contrast. Jessica remembered every word she had spoken, every assumption she had defended, every opportunity she had ignored. Marcus, meanwhile, seemed determined to move forward without humiliating her. That reality settled heavily inside her because it removed her last excuse. If he had reacted angrily, she might have focused on his behavior. If he had embarrassed her publicly, she might have blamed the humiliation. Instead, she was left alone with the facts. The unfairness belonged entirely to her actions. Nothing else distracted from it. Across the terminal, Marcus thanked an employee who wished him a safe flight. Then he stepped aside to let others continue working. No performance, no victory, just dignity. Jessica lowered her eyes again. The more grace he showed, the harder it became to defend herself, and the more obvious the imbalance of the morning appeared. Not to the crowd. Not to management. To her, for the first time, she truly felt the weight of what she had done. The terminal had grown quieter around the gate, not because people had lost interest, because most of them had already reached a conclusion. The tension that had filled the corridor earlier was gone. In its place remained something more permanent. Perspective. Jessica noticed it in the way people interacted. Hours earlier, employees had accepted her judgment without hesitation. That trust had seemed automatic, natural. Part of the authority she carried every day. Now the atmosphere felt different. Subtly. But unmistakably. The supervisor who normally checked in with her each morning remained occupied elsewhere. Coworkers spoke politely when necessary, yet conversations ended sooner than usual. Nobody acted hostile. Nobody needed to. The shift revealed itself through absence. Across the terminal, Marcus continued preparing for his flight. A maintenance worker stopped briefly to wish him a good trip. Another employee thanked him for helping resolve a scheduling issue months earlier. The exchanges were simple, yet each one strengthened something. Jessica could see happening in real time. Trust was moving, not through speeches. Not through formal decisions, through observation. People had witnessed how Marcus handled pressure. They had witnessed how Jessica handled it. The comparison lingered. Jessica leaned against the counter and watched quietly. A Cockpit. Few employees glanced toward her. Then toward Marcus. No judgment appeared on their faces. Just understanding. That somehow felt heavier, because understanding required no argument. The story had already explained itself. The authority Jessica once relied upon suddenly felt fragile. Not gone, just no longer unquestioned. Meanwhile, Marcus had never asked for support, yet support seemed to find him naturally. The difference became impossible to ignore. Jessica understood that the morning would be remembered. Not because of shouting, not because of punishment, because people had seen character revealed under pressure. As boarding preparations resumed, normal airport life slowly returned. But something beneath the routine had changed. The crowd no longer viewed the encounter through the lens of Jessica's certainty. They viewed it through the lens of Marcus's dignity. And standing there, Jessica sensed that change settling firmly into place around her. A quiet shift she could feel but no longer influence. As boarding preparations continued, conversations about the morning gradually gave way to something else. People began talking about Marcus. Not the incident, the man himself. Jessica overheard fragments while standing near the gate. He's been with the airline longer than most executives. I flew with him once. Best captain I've ever worked with. He never talks about what he's done. The comments were casual. Matter of fact. Spoken by people who clearly admired him. Jessica listened despite herself. Until that morning, Marcus Brooks had been a stranger. Now a different picture was forming, one built from years she had never seen. A senior crew member paused beside the counter and smiled faintly. Captain Brooks has helped a lot of people here. Another employee nodded. Quotes more than most know. Neither seemed interested in gossip. They were simply stating facts. The more Jessica heard, the clearer something became. Marcus's confidence had not come from arrogance. It had come from experience. The kind earned over decades. Not displayed. Earned. Across the terminal, Marcus reviewed paperwork with another pilot. Nothing about him suggested someone trying to impress others. He moved through conversations with the same calm presence he had shown throughout the confrontation. Steady. Measured. Unconcerned with proving himself. Jessica thought back to his reaction when she stopped him. No anger. No panic. No need to defend his worth. Now she understood why. A person does not spend a lifetime questioning himself after building a career like that. The realization settled quietly inside her. Marcus had walked toward the crew entrance, carrying far more than a uniform. He carried years of responsibility, thousands of flights, countless decisions affecting lives, a reputation that stretched far beyond one airport terminal. Yet none of those accomplishments had been visible at first glance. That was the point. People who knew him did not respect him because of stripes on his shoulders. They respected him because of the man behind them, and as Jessica watched him from a distance, she began to understand how little she had actually seen when she first looked his way that morning. What she saw now was only the result. The decades behind it remained invisible. Most people knew Marcus as a respected captain. Few knew where that calmness had truly been forged. Years before joining the airline, Marcus had worn a different uniform. An Air Force uniform. The memory surfaced often when younger pilots asked how he stayed so composed under pressure. The answer was never complicated. He had learned early that panic solved nothing. A former colleague once recalled a difficult training mission. Weather conditions had changed. Unexpectedly, several crew members were nervous. Marcus had remained focused. One pilot later asked him, "Weren't you worried?" Marcus had smiled. "Of course I was." The answer surprised everyone. "Then why didn't it show?" the pilot asked. Marcus shrugged. "Because fear isn't a plan." That attitude followed him throughout his career. Pressure never disappeared. He simply learned not to hand control over to it. Another former service member remembered a long night flight. Years earlier, equipment problems had created tension throughout the aircraft. Voices grew sharper. Frustration spread. Marcus remained steady. "Let's deal with one problem at a time," he had said. Nothing dramatic, nothing inspirational. Just calm. Leadership. The situation stabilized soon afterward. Those experiences shaped him long before he entered commercial aviation. They taught patience when emotions ran high, discipline when others rushed, restraint when pride invited conflict. That same restraint had appeared at Gate 20-1. Jessica understood that now. Marcus had not remained calm because the accusation didn't matter. He had remained calm because his character had been tested by far greater challenges long ago. Titles never became the source of his authority. Experience did. Responsibility did. The trust of others did. That was why people respected him so naturally. Not because he demanded attention, because he never needed to. As another employee greeted him warmly across the terminal, Jessica saw something she had missed from the beginning. The uniform mattered, but the man inside it mattered far more. And that difference explained everything. The situation stabilized soon. Afterward. And that same calm approach to pressure did not end with military service. It carried forward into every year Marcus spent in commercial aviation. Jessica stood quietly near the counter as boarding announcements echoed through the terminal again. This time, they felt distant. Her attention kept drifting back to Marcus. To the people around him. To the way they spoke his name with ease, like it belonged naturally in their conversations. Another employee passed by and said softly to a colleague, "I still remember his Atlantic route flights. Always smooth landings." The colleague nodded. "He's one of the most reliable captains in the fleet." Jessica listened without interrupting. 25 years. That number started forming in her mind. Not as a title. Not as a label, but as a weight of time she had not considered before. Marcus had spent more than 2 decades above the world. Flying through storms most passengers never even noticed, landing in cities that changed every week, dealing with emergencies that required immediate decisions, while hundreds of lives depended on him. Staying composed, a ground staff member nearby added. He once diverted a flight during severe turbulence, kept everyone calm the entire time. Another replied, "That's just how he works." No admiration in their tone. Just certainty. Jessica realized something uncomfortable. These weren't stories meant to impress. They were facts remembered because they had mattered in real time. Each flight added to a pattern, not of luck. Of consistency, of discipline repeated, until it became identity. Across the terminal, Marcus continued preparing for departure paperwork. He did not speak about his past. He did not reference his experience. He simply existed within it. That silence now felt more meaningful than anything said about him. Jessica thought back again to her first impression. A man walking calmly toward the crew entrance. A jacket. A conclusion made in seconds. Now those seconds felt dangerously small compared to the life behind him. 20-5 years of decisions. 20-5 years of responsibility. 20-5 years of proving himself without ever needing to announce it. And suddenly, her certainty from earlier that morning felt not just wrong, but painfully incomplete, because she had judged a lifetime in a moment that had taken decades to build. The realization did not arrive loudly. It settled in quietly, like everything else surrounding Marcus. Brooks. Jessica shifted slightly near the counter as another group of employees passed by. Their conversation caught her attention again. "You know he helped me pass my international certification." One young pilot said. Another responded quickly, same here. He doesn't make you feel small when you ask questions. That phrase lingered. Doesn't make you feel small. Jessica looked toward Marcus again. He was now speaking with a trainee pilot. The younger man stood slightly rigid at first. Nervous. Careful with his words. Marcus listened without interrupting. Then he said something simple. Tell me what you think went wrong first. The trainee hesitated. I think I rushed the descent calculation. Marcus nodded. Good, that's where you start fixing it. No frustration. No judgment. Just direction. The young pilot relaxed slightly. Jessica watched the exchange without meaning to. It was different from how she had seen authority used in her own environment. There was no pressure to prove worth. No fear of embarrassment. Only learning. Another employee nearby added quietly. He's the reason I didn't quit in my first year. Jessica turned her head slightly. The coworker continued. Most people correct you like they're reminding you you don't belong. He never does that. That sentence stayed with her longer than expected. Because it revealed something she had not considered before. Influence was not always loud. It did not require recognition. It worked quietly, over time, through repeated moments like this. Across the terminal, Marcus offered a brief nod to another passing pilot. The gesture was simple, but it carried history behind it. Years of mentoring, years of patience, years of choosing guidance over pride. Jessica began to understand that Marcus's reputation was not only built on flying safely. It was built on how many people he helped become better at their jobs without ever asking for credit. And that kind of influence did not fade easily. It stayed in the people he had trained. It stayed in their confidence, and it stayed in the way they now spoke about him without hesitation. Jessica remained near the counter, but the airport around her had begun to feel different. Again, not louder, not more chaotic, just more revealing. As boarding continued, she noticed how people naturally positioned themselves around Marcus. Not crowding him, not reacting to him. Simply moving with familiarity in his direction. A senior ground officer walked past and said, Captain Brooks, everything ready on your side? Marcus glanced up from his checklist. All set. Just confirming final fuel load. The officer nodded. Double quotes. Good. We're ahead of schedule because of you last time. Marcus replied calmly. That was a team effort. The officer smiled but shook his head. You always say that. Jessica heard it clearly. He always says that. Another employee nearby added quietly. He never takes credit, even when it's clearly his work. Jessica looked down for a moment. The idea of consistent respect began forming differently in her mind. Now. It wasn't based on one encounter, not based on a uniform, not based on authority titles. It was built through repetition, through trust confirmed over and over again. A baggage coordinator spoke to a colleague nearby. I've worked 3 shifts with him in emergencies. He never loses control. The colleague responded, that's why everyone wants him on difficult routes. Jessica listened without interrupting. The pattern was undeniable. People did not respect Marcus because of a single moment. They respected him because every moment reinforced the same truth. Preparedness. Fairness. Composure. Even during stress. He did not shift responsibility onto others, even when things went wrong. He did not break character. Across the terminal, Marcus signed off on final documents with another pilot. Their conversation was brief. Efficient. Professional. No extra words were needed. That silence itself seemed to carry meaning. Jessica realized something she had not fully understood. Earlier, respect was not declared. It accumulated. Slowly. Through Reliability. Through consistency. Through the absence of failure in how one treated others. And as she stood there watching, she understood that everything she had witnessed that morning was not a moment of surprise for the people around Marcus. It was simply another confirmation of a reputation they had already known for years. Jessica stayed near the counter as the final boarding calls continued, but her attention was no longer fixed on the present. It kept drifting. Not toward Marcus anymore, toward the people around him, because something had changed in how they spoke. Not louder. Not more emotional. More reflective. Flight operations officer passing by said quietly to a colleague, "I remember something similar a few years ago. A misunderstanding at check-in." Same calm response from him. The colleague replied, "I think I was there for that." He didn't escalate it at all. Jessica overheard it without meaning to. Another employee added from nearby, "He just corrected things and moved on." No ego. The words felt familiar, but now they landed differently. Because they no longer stood alone, they were connecting. One memory leading to another, across different people, across different years. Jessica found herself recalling her own earlier certainty again. How quickly she had acted, how final her judgment had felt. At the time, it had not seemed unusual. It had felt routine. Expected. Even responsible. But now, hearing fragments of Marcus's history from others, her memory began shifting, not changing. Reframing. A maintenance worker near the gate spoke softly. "I once saw him handle a crew dispute mid-flight. He just listened to both sides and solved it quietly." Another voice responded, "That sounds like him." No surprise. No debate. Just recognition. Jessica swallowed slightly. She began noticing something unsettling. The confrontation at Gate 21 was no longer isolated in how people remembered it. It was becoming part of a larger pattern, not about Marcus. But about perception itself. She thought back to small moments in her own past, times when she had assumed clarity too quickly, times when she had been certain without full understanding. Those memories, once dismissed as routine judgments, now felt heavier. Connected. Like pieces of something she had never assembled before. Around her, employees continued moving through their tasks, but even they seemed more thoughtful now. As if the morning had made them examine more than just what they saw. And Jessica realized that what had begun at a single gate was now reaching further than she had imagined, not outward, but inward. The airport continued its rhythm around her, but she no longer felt fully inside it. She watched Marcus from a distance again. He was still there, still speaking with staff, still preparing for departure. Nothing about him had changed since the first moment she saw him, yet everything around him had. A junior coordinator passed by and said softly to a colleague, "He never makes a scene about anything, even when he could." The colleague nodded. "That's why people trust him." Jessica listened. Trust. The word felt heavier now, not because it was unfamiliar, because it had been misplaced. Earlier, she looked again at Marcus. He did not raise his voice. Did not draw attention. Did not explain himself beyond what was necessary. Even now, after everything that had unfolded, he remained the same. Unshaken. Unperforming. Present without effort. A senior staff member nearby added quietly, "Some people spend their whole career proving who they are. He never had to." That sentence stayed with Jessica longer than the others, because it described something she had not understood at first glance. Marcus did not announce his worth. He carried it. Quietly. Consistently. Without needing approval. Jessica thought back to her own certainty earlier that morning. How quickly she had formed it. How complete it felt. How unnecessary she believed questioning it was. Now that certainty felt incomplete, not because Marcus had changed, but because she had finally seen what had been there all along. Colleague nearby adjusted a flight manifest and said, "He's already done enough to be respected. He doesn't need to prove anything." Jessica lowered her gaze slightly. The contrast became clearer with every passing moment. Her assumptions had required only seconds to form. But Marcus's reality had required years to build, and yet she had trusted the first more than the second. That realization did not come with noise. It came quietly, like everything else that morning. And for the first time, Jessica understood how easily quiet dignity can be overlooked when someone is not trying to be seen. Days later, the airport no longer carried the same tension in visible form. But behind closed doors, something was changing. It started without announcement. No public statement. No loud correction. Just a series of meetings scheduled quietly, in administrative calendars. Conference rooms that normally handled routine operations were now occupied for something different. Reviews. Interviews. Questions that could no longer be ignored. Jessica was not present in the first session, but she heard about it later from a colleague. "They're asking about that morning at Gate 21. The colleague said carefully. Jessica paused, and the colleague hesitated. "Not just that morning." That answer stayed with her longer than expected. Inside those rooms, investigators began speaking to staff one by one. At first, employees assumed it was standard procedure, a routine review of passenger access protocols. But the questions were not limited to procedures. They were about perception. About judgment. About past experiences. One ground staff member described the incident calmly. Another mentioned similar moments from earlier shifts. A flight coordinator added quietly, "It's not the first time something like this has been raised." That sentence changed the tone of the room, because it suggested something larger than a single misunderstanding. Jessica, hearing fragments of these reports later, felt the weight of them differently than before. What had once seemed like an isolated moment at a gate was now being placed alongside other memories. Other reports. Other silences. The investigators did not interrupt. They simply listened and wrote. Across the airline, people began realizing they were being asked not just what happened, but how often similar judgments had gone unspoken. The pattern was becoming harder to separate from routine behavior, and Jessica, sitting alone that evening after work, began to understand something she had not seen at the time. That the morning at Gate 21 was never just about one decision. It was about everything that made that decision feel normal in the first place. As the investigation continued, more employees were called in. Different roles, different departments, different shifts. Yet when they began speaking, something unexpected started to emerge. Similarity. Not in wording, but in pattern. A ground staff member leaned forward in the conference room and said carefully, "I've seen passengers questioned before, just because someone wasn't sure they belonged in a certain area." The investigator did not interrupt, only wrote. A supervisor added next, "It doesn't always look like a problem at first. It looks like caution." Another voice followed shortly after. A flight crew member spoke quietly. "You start trusting the assumption more than the person." The room remained still. Jessica was not in the room, but when she later heard about these statements, they did not feel new to her. They felt connected, like fragments she had never assembled before. Inside the investigation room, the pattern became clearer with each testimony. One department described hesitation. Another described selective attention. Another described silence after mistakes were made. Different voices. Same structure. Underneath. An investigator finally asked, "Do these situations feel isolated to you?" A long pause followed. Then someone answered honestly. Double quotes, "No, not really." That answer changed the direction of the discussion, because it suggested repetition rather than coincidence. Outside the room, Employees began quietly comparing notes after their shifts, not officially. Not loudly, just in passing conversations. I thought it was just me. One said, "Same thing happened on my route." Another replied, Jessica, hearing these reflections later, realized something uncomfortable. What she had once considered a single moment of poor judgment was now appearing across multiple stories. Different people, different days. Same underlying behavior, and investigators, listening carefully, began to see that the issue was not about isolated misunderstandings. It was about a shared way of seeing that no one had questioned deeply enough before. And the investigators did not speak immediately, because what they were beginning to see could not be reduced to a single explanation anymore. Inside the conference room, another staff member adjusted their seat before speaking, voice low and careful. "I don't know if anyone ever wrote it down," the ground staff member said, "but certain passengers always get stopped twice, even when nothing is wrong." The investigator looked up slowly, pen still in hand, and asked, "Always the same kind of passengers?" A long pause followed before another supervisor replied, "Not officially. But yes, that's how it feels on the ground." Jessica heard about this later, and when she did, the words did not sound like accusation, but like something closer to realization forming too late. Inside the room, another voice added quietly, "We don't question it because it looks normal until you compare it." That sentence shifted the atmosphere slightly, because comparison was something no one had formally discussed before. Another investigator asked, "So it's not written rules, it's behavior patterns?" "Yes," someone answered after a pause, "and most of us didn't notice it because it was normal to us." The room grew quieter again, as if everyone was recalculating moments they had previously ignored. And for the first time, the pattern no longer felt like coincidence, but like something structured through repetition and unchecked comfort. One staff member responded quietly, "They hesitate." And usually the assumption wins before the question does. The investigator stopped writing for a moment, then said, "That hesitation is what we are really here to understand." Number one spoke after that, because the meaning of the pattern was no longer hidden in incidents, but in silence itself, becoming visible now for everyone present. As the investigation moved forward, that silence began to loosen in unexpected ways, not loudly, not suddenly, but carefully, as if people were opening doors they had kept shut for years. In another interview room, a flight attendant hesitated before speaking. "I wasn't sure I should mention this," she said. Eyes lowered. The investigator replied softly, "You can just tell us what you remember." A pause, then she continued, "There was a situation months ago, similar feeling. Someone was questioned more than others without a clear reason." She stopped again, unsure. "I didn't report it. Why not?" The investigator asked. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table. "Because it didn't feel like something I could challenge. It felt normal at the time." That word stayed in the room longer than expected. Normal. Across another session, a ground staff member leaned back in their chair before speaking. "There were moments we all noticed things," they admitted, "but nobody wanted to be the one to make it a problem." The investigator wrote slowly, not interrupting. And then came another voice. "I remember thinking it wasn't my place." Jessica would later hear fragments of these testimonies, and each one carried the same uncomfortable weight. Not anger, not accusation, memory, buried experiences resurfacing. Not because they were new, but because they were finally being connected. Inside the interviews, people began to realize they were not describing separate events. They were describing a shared pattern of hesitation. One employee said quietly, "I think we all thought staying quiet was safer than being wrong." That sentence seemed to settle over the room, because it revealed something deeper than procedure. It revealed fear shaped by routine. And as more memories surfaced, the investigation was no longer about what happened at Gate 21. Alone. It was about everything that had been left unspoken long before that moment ever arrived. That realization changed the direction of the investigation again, because what followed those buried memories was not just recollection. It was recognition of silence itself as part of the system. In the next round of interviews, investigators began asking a different question. Not only what happened, but what happened after people noticed. A senior ground operations staff member leaned forward slowly. "We saw things," he admitted, "but it never went beyond talk in the break room." The investigator asked, "Why not formal reporting?" A long pause. Then the answer came carefully, "Because nothing ever changed when people spoke up before." That sentence carried more weight than anything said earlier. In another interview, a supervisor looked down before responding. "You learn quickly which issues disappear and which ones create problems for you." The investigator stopped writing for a moment. "Problems for you?" The supervisor nodded slightly. "Not for the system. For the person reporting it." Jessica would later hear summaries of these statements. And they did not feel like new revelations. They felt like explanations of something she had never thought to question. Inside the investigation rooms, a pattern became clear. People often noticed early signs, but noticing was not the same as acting. One employee said quietly, "We talked about it. We just didn't think it was ours to fix." Another added, "And over time, it stopped feeling urgent." That shift mattered more than any single incident, because urgency disappearing meant problems could remain untouched while appearing normal. Investigators began connecting this silence across departments. Not as absence, but as protection. A system where discomfort was acknowledged privately, but never escalated publicly. Where concerns dissolved before reaching accountability. And the more they listened, the clearer it became. The issue was not only what people saw. It was what they learned to leave alone, and in that leaving alone, the problem had quietly been allowed to stay, and in that leaving alone, the problem had quietly been allowed to stay. But now, that silence could no longer remain informal, because what once lived in hallway whispers was entering official records. In the next stage of the investigation, employees were no longer speaking casually. They were speaking carefully. Recorded, documented. A flight attendant sat across from the investigator, hands folded tightly. "I never thought I would be saying this formally," she admitted. The investigator responded, "Just speak from your experience." She nodded, then exhaled slowly. There were conversations among staff about how certain situations always seemed to follow the same pattern. Another pause, and I realize now we all thought we were alone in noticing it. As more testimonies were added, something unusual began to happen. The stories matched, not word for word, but in structure. In pattern. In feeling. A ground supervisor reviewed their statement twice before signing it. "I used to think it was just my impression," he said quietly. "But hearing others say it too makes it harder to ignore." The investigator underlined one phrase in his notes: shared recognition. Jessica, reading fragments of the compiled statements later, felt something shift that was not loud or dramatic. It was alignment, separate memories, beginning to point in the same direction. One employee added during recording, "We didn't coordinate our stories. We didn't need to. It just happened to us in similar ways." That sentence became important in the file because it explained why the testimonies carried weight. They were not built together. They were discovered together, and that discovery changed how the investigation understood credibility. Another witness spoke more firmly than before. "If this is what many of us experienced separately, then it is not coincidence anymore." No one interrupted, because now, silence would not erase the pattern. It would only confirm it. And for the first time, the narrative was no longer fragmented. It was forming into something unified enough to be believed beyond doubt. And that discovery changed how the Investigation understood credibility. Because once the testimonies aligned, the focus began to shift again, slowly, deliberately, away from one person, toward everything around her, in the next internal meeting. The lead investigator placed a folder on the table and spoke without raising his voice. "We are no longer looking at isolated behavior," he said. A supervisor asked carefully, "Then what are we looking at?" The answer came after a short pause: "Pattern supported by environment." That phrase changed the tone in the room. Jessica's name still appeared in reports, but it was no longer the only line of inquiry. Documents began referencing training structures, reporting gaps, and managerial responses. One analyst pointed to a timeline. "Look here," she said. "Complaints appear, but the response cycle resets every time. No escalation, no correction, just closure." Another investigator added quietly, "That means the system is absorbing the issue without changing it." The room stayed silent for a moment, because that idea was harder to accept than individual fault. In a separate review session, someone asked, "Are we still treating this as misconduct?" The lead investigator shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "We are examining culture now." Jessica, hearing about this shift later, felt something unfamiliar. Not defense, not anger, but displacement, as if her actions were no longer standing alone, but being placed inside something much larger, inside the documentation process. References expanded beyond her incident: training protocols, supervisory discretion, unwritten norms. One report summary stated clearly, "The behavior observed cannot be fully explained without considering the environment that allowed it to persist." Number one argued with that line because it reflected what the evidence had already begun to show. And slowly, what began as a single confrontation at Gate 21 was no longer centered on one employee's judgment. It was becoming a mirror held up to a system that had shaped, permitted, and repeated it without interruption for years. It was becoming a mirror held up to a system that had shaped, permitted, and repeated it without interruption for years. By the time the first full review cycle neared completion, that mirror no longer felt comfortable to look into. Inside the conference room, the air had changed, not with tension, but with weight. Folders were stacked unevenly across the table, each one representing a voice, a record, a pattern. One investigator leaned back slightly, rubbing his forehead. "This is more than we expected," he said quietly. No one contradicted him. Another colleague sorted through printed statements, then paused. "We thought we were reviewing an incident," she admitted. "But this reads like a system report." The lead investigator didn't respond immediately. He only looked at the notes in front of him, as if recalculating their meaning. Jessica's case was still present in the documents, but it no longer anchored the conversation. Instead, it had become a reference point among many. A supervisor spoke carefully. "If this is consistent across departments, then we're not dealing with isolated mistakes." A silence followed, because no one wanted to complete that sentence out loud. Another investigator finally said it anyway, then. "We are dealing with something embedded." That word stayed in the room longer than expected. Embedded. As the team continued organizing findings, concern replaced routine procedure. One analyst closed her notebook slowly. "This affects more than one person's judgment," she said. "It affects how decisions are being made everywhere." No one disagreed. Even the earlier assumptions about scale had begun to feel small compared to what was unfolding. And for the first time, the investigation stopped feeling like it was moving toward closure. Instead, it felt like it was opening something that could not be neatly contained, something that would force the entire organization to look at itself, not as it believed it was, but as it had actually been operating for years without interruption. Something that would force the entire organization to look at itself, Not as it believed it was, but as it had actually been operating for years without interruption. And yet, outside those rooms, the world was already beginning to move on. Weeks later, the story that once filled every feed and headline started to thin out. News outlets that once repeated every detail now shifted to newer events. A different crisis, a different name, a different moment for public attention. Inside a small newsroom, an editor glanced at the analytics screen and said, "It's dropping fast. People aren't clicking anymore." Another replied without looking up, "They rarely stay long on anything like this." And just like that, the coverage reduced to brief summaries. No updates. No follow-ups. Only fragments. Online. Comment sections that were once active turned quiet or were archived. The conversation didn't end with resolution. It simply dissolved into the next cycle of content. A social media user scrolled past an old clip and paused briefly. "Oh yeah, that airport thing," they said. Before continuing to scroll, that pause was short, almost automatic, and then gone. But inside the airline, nothing had moved on in the same way. Employees still remembered the shift in atmosphere. Even if they no longer discussed it openly, Jessica's name no longer appeared in trending searches. But the consequences of that day remained embedded in internal files and pending reviews. In the investigation office, one staff member observed quietly, "Public attention has dropped, but the documentation hasn't." The lead investigator nodded. "That's usually how it goes," he replied, "because attention was temporary, but records were not." And while the internet moved forward without hesitation, the systems underneath continued processing what had already been exposed. Quietly, methodically, without the urgency the outside world had already forgotten. And in that gap between fading headlines and ongoing consequences, the distance between perception and reality only grew wider. And in that gap between fading headlines and ongoing consequences, the distance between perception and reality only grew wider. But soon, even the noise that replaced it began to disappear. Online platforms that once carried constant debates about the incident started to quiet down. Notifications slowed, then stopped. One by one, the discussions lost momentum until they no longer appeared in daily feeds. A content moderator reviewing engagement logs noted, "It's dropping off completely now." Another replied, "People have moved to the next thing." And that was it. No ceremony. No conclusion. Just absence. But inside that absence, something unexpected began to settle. Because silence was not the same as resolution. Jessica felt it first in the empty pauses of her phone. No new messages. No incoming calls tied to the event. Only the normal rhythm of unrelated notifications. At the airline, corridors that once felt tense during the height of attention now returned to routine movement. But not comfort. People spoke less about what had happened, not because it was resolved, but because it had become sensitive to mention. A coworker in the break room lowered their voice and said, "It's better not to talk about it anymore." Another nodded without argument. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was cautious. In the investigation office, reports continued to be processed. But even there, the tone shifted. Less urgency. More documentation. One analyst said quietly, "It feels like the storm passed." But nothing was actually repaired. The lead investigator closed a file slowly. "That's the part people don't see," he replied. "After the attention leaves, everything still has to be dealt with." And in that realization, silence stopped feeling like closure. It started feeling like exposure without protection. Because when the noise fades, there is nothing left to soften the weight of what remains unresolved. Only the truth, sitting quietly where everyone can see it. But fewer are willing to speak about it anymore. Because when the noise fades, there is nothing left to soften the weight of what remains unresolved. And in that silence, consequences continue moving, not in headlines, not in comment sections, but in private spaces, where decisions are still being made, inside the airline offices. The investigation files remain open on desks long after the public conversation has ended. One HR officer flipped through a report and said quietly, "People think it's over." Another replied without looking up, "It isn't. Because while attention disappears, internal processes do not. Meetings still happen, reviews still continue, and names remain attached to outcomes that cannot be erased by time or silence." Jessica felt that shift most clearly in the absence of casual normalcy around her. Not hostility, not confrontation, but distance. Subtle, but consistent. In a hallway conversation, a colleague hesitated before speaking, then simply said, "We're all being more careful now." Jessica understood what that meant without needing further explanation. Careful did not mean forgetful. It meant aware. In another office, a manager reviewed updated protocols and said, "This is going to affect how we handle situations going forward." A supervisor responded, "It already has." Outside the organization, people had moved on emotionally, but inside it, every action still carried the weight of what had been revealed. Even those not directly involved adjusted their behavior, aware that scrutiny had once entered the space and might return again. And for those named in reports or connected to the incident, the impact did not dissolve with public attention. It settled into files, reputations, and conversations that would not be broadcast but would still shape futures. One investigator summed it up quietly during a late review session. "News cycles end," he said, "but consequences don't wait for them to finish." And in that truth, the separation between public memory and private reality became impossible to ignore. Because even when the world stops watching, the outcomes of what it saw do not stop unfolding. Because even when the world stops watching, the outcomes of what it saw do not stop unfolding. And inside the airline, those outcomes began turning into memory. Not the kind that fades with time, but the kind that stays attached to everyday decisions. Weeks after the investigation quieted, employees still found themselves returning to that morning at gate 20-1. Not in formal meetings, but in small, unplanned conversations. A baggage handler adjusting equipment said softly, "I still think about that day sometimes." A colleague beside him nodded, "Yeah, it doesn't really leave you." In the break room, a flight attendant paused before sitting down and then said, "It changed how people look at things now." No one asked for clarification. Everyone already understood, because the incident had become more than a single event. It had turned into reference. A point people used, consciously or not, to measure behavior afterward. In a training session, an instructor carefully chose words while addressing the group. "We don't rush assumptions," she said. "We take a step back." And though she did not mention the incident directly, several employees exchanged brief looks. They remembered inside management discussions, the tone also shifted. A supervisor reviewing procedures commented, "People are more aware now. That changes how decisions get made." Another added, "Which should." And that awareness lingered beyond official documentation, because memory inside workplaces is not only about what is recorded. It is also about what is retold in quiet moments when authority is not present. Jessica herself felt that shift indirectly, not through confrontation. But through the way people paused slightly, longer before speaking around her. Through the way certain topics were avoided. Through the way silence now carried meaning that it did not carry before. One senior staff member summarized it during a routine check-in. It's not just an incident anymore, he said. It's part of how people think here now. And in that transformation, the event stopped being something that happened once. It became something that continued to exist, shaping perception long after its original moment had passed. And in that transformation, the event stopped being something that happened once. It became something that continued to exist, shaping perception long after its original moment had passed. But even that memory did not stay fixed. It began to shift again, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. What had once been a sharp, specific incident at Gate 21 started dissolving into something broader in public discussion. In online forums, where the story still appeared in archived threads, users no longer focused on the exact confrontation. Instead, the language changed. One user wrote, "It's not just about one airport moment. It's about how quickly assumptions become facts in workplaces." Another replied, "This happens everywhere, not just there." At the airline, employees noticed the same shift in conversations when the topic came up. A ground staff member said quietly, "People don't even talk about Jessica anymore. They talk about how these things happen in general." A colleague nodded, "Yeah. It's like the story moved away from her." Inside internal meetings, managers reviewed feedback reports that referenced culture, awareness, and decision-making patterns more than individual behavior. One senior officer remarked, "The conversation is no longer about what happened that day. It's about how we think in situations like it." Another added, "That makes it harder to ignore. Because once a story stops belonging to one person, it stops being contained." Jessica still felt the residue of it in subtle ways, not in direct reference, but in how discussions around fairness and judgment were now framed in her presence. Careful, measured, wider in scope than before. Even the investigation summaries reflected this change. A final note in one document read, "The incident has evolved into a reference point for systemic reflection." And that phrase captured the shift completely. What began as a moment of confrontation had expanded into something larger than consequence. It had become a lens through which people now examined not just one event, but the habits, assumptions, and structures that allowed it to happen in the first place. It had become a lens through which people now examine not just one event, but the habits, assumptions, and structures that allowed it to happen in the first place. And even as the story shifted into broader reflection, its impact did not weaken. It simply moved into quieter places where headlines could no longer reach. In the weeks that followed, life at the airline continued outwardly as before, but internally it had changed shape. Some employees adjusted quickly, learning from what had been revealed and becoming more careful in how they approached situations. A senior supervisor noted during a briefing, "People are second-guessing assumptions more now." "That's new," another replied. "It's necessary." For others, the adjustment was harder. A few staff members withdrew socially, choosing silence over participation in conversations that now felt heavier than before. One ground crew member admitted quietly during a shift change, "I don't really talk about it anymore. I just think about it differently now." Outside the workplace, there were those who had never been directly involved, but still felt the echo of the event in their awareness.
A passenger recalling the news months later said, "I don't remember all the details, but I remember how fast people assumed things." And that lingering awareness became part of everyday judgment, even outside aviation spaces. Inside internal reports, the language softened but deepened. Terms like awareness shift, behavioral review, and procedural reflection began appearing in reports. They replaced the earlier urgency but carried even greater weight. Jessica's name appeared less frequently in discussions, but her presence remained embedded in training materials and reference notes. One document summarized it simply. The incident continues to influence decision-making beyond its original timeline. And that sentence captured the essence of what had happened. Because even without attention, without discussion, without visibility, the effects continued moving. Through habits, through hesitation, through changed perception. And in that way, the event did not end when the world stopped watching. It continued living quietly inside every space it had already touched.